But first tonight. Over the weekend, Palestinian protesters, not content with their massive global anti-Semitism rallies, brought them into the heart of Jewish suburbs, designed to intimidate and threaten Jewish families, including children, on the weekend outside their homes. As Israel battles for its very survival and brave young Jewish men and women who never asked for war venture into Gaza to fight Hamas on the militants' home turf, risking their lives to fight for the sovereignty and security of a Jewish homeland and to protect all of us around the world from terrorism. What we're ultimately seeing, and what we're still trying to make sense of, is Israel exercising its right to exist, its right to defend itself. It's this that has led to a surge in anti-Semitism globally. It has reached emergency levels in Australia. There's been a 600% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. This weekend, in Melbourne and in Sydney, we were horrified to see a new low of devastating anti-Semitism. And it's led to many of us asking, where is our political leadership? Where is our law enforcement? And it's a point I'm going to come back to. But first, let's have a look at what happened over the weekend. Well, first, on Friday night, authorities allowed a pro-Palestinian protest to take place in a Melbourne suburb, Caulfield, where nearly half the population is Jewish. The protest should never have been allowed to take place in Caulfield. A synagogue was evacuated, Friday night Shabbos prayers cancelled, and the Jewish community were left exposed as aggressors entered their streets. Jewish supporters slowly came out to take a presence on the other side of the road from the rally to say, "We won't be intimidated by you." The Australian's journalist Cameron Stewart was there, and here's what he said happened.
The rally started off about 200 people, pro-Palestinians, adjacent to a synagogue, and it started off peacefully for a very short time, and then the chants from the Palestinian supporters got a lot more nasty. They were talking about chanting, from the river to the sea, which of course calls for the wiping of Israel off the map. Also, a couple of other chants.
He went on to describe how a police barrier couldn't stop the aggressive pro-Palestinian protesters from throwing rocks and running across the road towards the Jews.
Oh, the pepper spray's out! Stay back! Stay back! Shame on the police! Shame on Victoria! Shame on Victoria! Shame on who came in! Shame! Yeah! Shame on Victoria!
Here is the question. What are they protesting, Jews or Israel? If Israel, then there's no reason to rally outside a synagogue to enter a highly populated Jewish suburb. If Jews, then the protest is unapologetically anti-Semitic and doesn't pretend to be otherwise, and it shouldn't have been allowed. And then on Saturday evening, a bikie rally was organised from Lidcombe to Coogee in Sydney's east, where again there's a high Jewish population. This was in broad daylight. There are many families at Coogee Beach where children probably would have been fearful of the shouting and intimidating bikies. You can see in this video not Palestinian flags being flown. Well, there were some Palestinian flags, but here, flags with the Shahada. It's a sentence from the Islamic oath that means there's no other God but Allah. And while the sentence itself isn't violent, when it's raised on a black flag at a protest like this, it's well associated with other terror organisations. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have the Shahada on their flags. These pro-Palestinian protests in Jewish suburbs are designed purely to intimidate and threaten our community, including children. And not just the Jewish community, but this is frightening for everyone who would have been at Coogee Beach on Saturday. I again ask, what are they protesting, Jews or Israel? If Israel, then there's no reason to have a motorbike rally that ends in a Jewish suburb. and the police should have gone to court to declare both of these rallies in Caulfield and Coogee unlawful. What's the point in having these laws if they're not enforced? But instead of declaring the bikie rally unlawful, police actually escorted the aggressors while they rode to the eastern suburbs purely to intimidate Jews. And then also on the weekend, a war memorial was desecrated in Melbourne, sprayed with anti-Israel graffiti. As you can see, the vandalism says "Shame Israel, USA, UK and Australia." It says "Ceasefire now" and "Free Palestine." Red, capital letters, vandalising a memorial that is there in honour of people who died during their service in World War I. And then in another shocking incident, a Jewish-owned restaurant in Surrey Hills, Sydney was vandalised also on Saturday night. Child murder, steal our identity was sprayed across the Shaffa restaurant, which serves Middle Eastern food inspired by Tel Aviv's markets. And this all took place on Remembrance Day, and just a day after the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when Jewish homes and shop fronts were destroyed in a wave of anti-Semitic violence by the Nazis in 1938. Police are also investigating dozens of other incidents where Jews report anti-Semitism or have been physically attacked. Commentator Neil Mitchell spoke about one of these cases where an elderly man was thrown from his bicycle and assaulted.
My fear is this isn't isolated. This was posted overnight. I've got the name of the witness, and my fear is this sort of thing is just going unreported. I'll just read it to you direct, quote, "As my two sisters and I were driving down Chapel Street earlier tonight, we witnessed an assault on an elderly Jewish man draped in an Israeli flag. The man was peacefully riding his bike down Chapel Street and was grabbed and pulled to the ground from behind by a young girl who had left the bar to come out and assault this man because he was Jewish. As he got up and picked his bike back up to continue riding, he was met with two men who had also come running from the bar, who threw punches and then slung him across the road in front of my car and kicked him in the back of the head. Others, both from the bar and on the street, including my parents, quickly got involved and separated them. It was disgusting."
As I mentioned, we're looking at a 600% rise in reported anti-Semitic incidents, and many people don't report what happens to them. Now, I've heard other commentators say that they don't have a problem with the pro-Palestinian protests. Well, neither do I in principle, but when they're against your very religion, it's not against Israel, it's against Jewish people, then there is something very deeply troubling about them. Paul Murray said last night that if there was a march to intimidate the Mardi Gras, the media would be reacting very differently. Well, immediately after these aggressive protests on Friday and Saturday night, I would have expected to hear the Prime Minister stand up, call a press conference and say enough is enough, this aggression has got to stop, and announce sweeping new laws to protect the Jewish community. But that's not what happened. There was absolute silence from Anthony Albanese, nothing until a member of the press gallery asked why he hadn't said anything. And so 24 hours after a synagogue service was cancelled, the Prime Minister released a short written statement where he just said this: "All of us have a responsibility to preserve the peace here at home, to maintain the harmony and respect that unites us. It is always worth repeating, there is no place in our nation for hatred or prejudice of any kind." Well, that is weak and pathetic, Prime Minister. And instead of supporting the Jews, Foreign Minister Penny Wong came out and lectured Israel and wrongly accused Israel of targeting hospitals and implied that Israel wasn't abiding by international law.
Australia is a democracy and so too is Israel, and the standards that we seek and accept are higher. And international humanitarian law is very clear about the principles that need to be applied by Israel. They are distinction, they are precaution, and they are proportionality. We have seen a harrowing number of civilians, including children, killed. This has to end. We are particularly concerned with what is happening with medical facilities.
And on she went. So instead of hearing alarm from the federal government about the truly unprecedented nature of what's unfolding here in Australia, Penny Wong once again criticised Israel. And Peter Dutton today called her comments reckless. Well, Jewish leaders also came out and strongly criticised Penny Wong, as you can see on the front page of The Australian today, reminding her that Article 19 of the Geneva Convention explicitly states that hospitals lose their protection if they're used for military purposes. And Hamas has based itself under Shifa and other hospitals. The Jewish leaders said, and I quote, "The libel that any Israeli attack on Gazan hospitals from which Hamas operates would amount to war crimes only serves to demonise the state of Israel and its supporters. Those libels are central to Hamas's objectives as a terror organisation and are reverberating across the world in a new wave of anti-Semitism. The government of Australia should not be lending any credibility to this false and harmful narrative. Instead, it should unequivocally state that Hamas is morally and legally responsible for the suffering of civilians in Gaza as a result of starting this war and its dozens of war crimes that purposefully endanger Palestinian civilians for tactical and propaganda advantage." Penny Wong and Albanese's comments nearly every single day accusing Israel of killing children are working to inflame the very anti-Semitism we're horrified by, and that they should be calming down. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson has made this point today and accused Penny Wong of directly inflaming anti-Semitism.
And that point about words being important is really critical, because unfortunately we do see here in Australia tempers being whipped up and people getting very activated over what is being said. And so for the Foreign Minister on Insiders to accuse Israel of attacking hospitals, and for other ministers in the government to leave open the possibility that Israel is guilty of genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, is a very dangerous and inflammatory thing to do when we should be urging calm. I am deeply afraid, Laura, that something terrible is going to happen in this country. All the signs are there.
James Paterson there accusing Penny Wong of inflammatory comments that could encourage anti-Semitism when she should be urging calm. And here's another point about Penny Wong's remark that Israel should be held to a higher standard than Hamas and should pursue a ceasefire. Well, what is the inference of that? That we should be making allowances for Hamas and their murderous barbarity? That we should make excuses for their avowed intent to eradicate Jews? That we should accept what Hamas did on October 7 because they have lower standards? What kind of moral bankruptcy is this? Expecting Israel to agree to a ceasefire in their perfectly legal steps to defend their nation and their people. And by the way, Penny Wong's accusations against Israel are utterly wrong. Israel is not just abiding by international law, it is going above and beyond to do so. It is taking every effort to minimise casualties by warning people to leave areas before it attacks. Look at these statistics. Since this war began, Israel has dropped 1.5 million flyers, sent 6 million voice messages, 4 million text messages, and made phone calls on top of all of that, including staying on the phone to people until they've evacuated their apartments. And despite these efforts, many civilians have died in Gaza. It's tragic but unavoidable when Hamas hides within civilian populations, often forcing them to remain in areas that are to be attacked. That from Richard Kemp. And in his article, Richard Kemp also points out that the casualty figures that are just blindly repeated by all the media are actually supplied by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry, which makes no distinction between terrorists and civilians. So not only is Penny Wong wrong to think she's so morally superior that she should lecture Israel on its military tactics, I haven't seen Penny Wong lecture any other countries on how they fight battles, only the Jewish state of Israel. And even other figures on the left, like Hillary Clinton, disagree with her.
But remember, there was a ceasefire on October 6th that Hamas broke by their barbaric assault on peaceful civilians and their kidnapping, their killing, their beheading, their terrible, inhumane savagery. There was a ceasefire. It did not hold because Hamas chose to break it. So you have to keep several things in your head at the same time, and that is, number one, Hamas is a terrorist organization. It has made very clear it is committed to the elimination of the state of Israel, and it has consistently broken ceasefires over a number of years.
And not even everyone within Penny Wong's own Labor team agree with her. Labor MP Josh Burns doesn't. He says that asking Israel for a ceasefire without the return of hostages would be akin to telling their families that they are giving up on bringing their loved ones home. Now, the reason that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese's accusations against Israel are at risk of further inflaming the anti-Semitism we're seeing is because they give legitimacy to hatred against Israel, the Jewish homeland. Executive Council of Australian Juries Alex Rivchin said that the anti-Semitism and this movement against Israel has now emerged as something righteous. He told Claire Lehmann today that the expulsion or destruction of Jews was always framed as a necessary righteous act, and he sees the attitude appearing on Australian streets today. The mindset of today's anti-Semites is what is most concerning because it means there is no shame in their deeds and instead a sense of mission and purpose that can turn an aggressive fringe movement into something truly terrifying. And it's this very movement that Penny Wong and Albanese are emboldening. And the ABC too, by the way. With all this anti-Semitism we're seeing, the ABC tonight on Q&A will give a platform to two guests who've expressed highly offensive comments about Jews and Israel. UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese and Australia's top Palestinian spokesman Nasser Mashni, who you'll recall I spoke about on the show on Thursday evening, and he's called for the destruction of Israel. They'll both be given a platform on the ABC tonight. Commentator Claire Lehmann writes in her excellent column in The Australian today, if a coalition minister posed in a photograph with a neo-Nazi who had called for Jews to be murdered on a radio show, the Australian media and public would rightly be apoplectic. But Australia's foreign minister can pose with the left-wing equivalent and it barely raises a yawn. And she's referring there to the well-known photograph that we keep playing of Penny Wong with Nasser Mashni. But this anti-Semitism we're seeing is getting worse, not better, and that's in part because of a serious lack of political leadership in this country. Where is the Prime Minister standing up to unequivocally say this needs to stop? He's just not doing it.
The Prime Minister has failed to show leadership here. It took him 24 hours before he said anything about the protests in Caulfield, and when he did, it was a very generic statement about how we should all be very nice to each other and we should all get along. I think it's very clear the problem we have on his hands in this country right now. It is anti-Semitism, and if we don't deal with it, something terrible is going to happen.
Instead, the Prime Minister keeps lecturing Israel almost as much, or maybe more, than he's criticising Hamas. When Albanese is asked about anti-Semitism, he turns his answer to Islamophobia, like Penny Wong does. Well, can't we just stop the moral equivalence? There is no equivalent Islamophobia crisis here, but there is an anti-Semitism emergency. The aggression towards Jews is reaching boiling point. If and when there is an Islamophobia crisis, as James Patterson said today and Paul Murray said last night, we will call it out strongly. But right now, the government is seriously gaslighting Jews. It's not good enough to prioritise domestic politics over the security of a section of our population. Labor is equivocating because there are no Jews in their marginal Western Sydney seats. This shows their lack of moral compass. This hatred that's arising is greater than base politics. This is real life. This is dangerous. This has real consequences for our lives and our safety. Inaccurate words from political leaders and irresponsible reporting from the ABC can inflame terrible crimes. You can't help but conclude that right now, this federal government is no friend of Israel and is not here to protect our Jewish community.